Hey, how's it going, everybody? Mike Weber here. Today I want to talk a little bit about this idea that people have that's being pushed in the media, that somehow it's the government's job, or that the government, in fact, actually can help people out, can give away money, and somehow that's going to make the economy better, make people better off, etc., with no cost, or a cost that somehow doesn't exist. So I want to start out and read a couple quotes from Powell in some of his recent statements. To the extent we can make people whole, we should do that, said Powell. Now, what does he mean by that? He doesn't mean make the average citizen whole. What he means is print trillions and trillions of dollars and give that money directly to the elite people in America, corporate America, and to the 1% to make sure that they get richer and richer on the backs of the average American who gets left holding the bag for all of this massive debt and money devaluation that is going to have to take place by necessity as a result of the debt and money printing that's taking place right now. Here's another quote. "We are deploying these lending powers to an unprecedented extent, enabled in large part by the financial backing from Congress and Treasury. We will continue to use these powers forcefully, proactively, and aggressively until we are confident that we are solidly on the road to recovery," said Powell. So again, what does he mean by that? He means printing trillions and trillions of dollars and doling them out to hedge funds, to private equity companies, to venture capital people, to the banking industry, and to corporate America, and giving a few pennies to the average citizen to make them think that they're actually being helped. And of course, the narrative in the media and the narrative that both the government and the Federal Reserve push on us to make us believe that they're actually here to help us is that they're saving jobs, they're helping small businesses, they're taking care of Main Street. These are all lies. These are all things that are meant to make you believe that they're actually there to help and support us, which is absolutely not the case. And in fact, it's entirely impossible. The US government is flat broke. We've doubled our deficit in a very short period of time, and it's increasing at an astronomical pace right now. So this year alone, we will probably run a deficit between 10 and 20% of the entire US gross domestic product. Now, that is a massive amount of debt for the country to take on, and that money doesn't exist somewhere. The government isn't sitting on a giant pile of money because they've been fiscally responsible for a long time. In fact, it's the opposite. The country's broke, the government's broke, the citizens are broke, the states, cities, and municipalities are broke, and all we're doing is borrowing money from the future, which is going to make us all poorer and devalue the currency that's already in existence. So let's talk a little bit about where this money comes from that the government doesn't actually have. So in order to generate this money, traditionally what we do is we borrow money from the rest of the world by issuing treasuries. So essentially, they buy our treasuries, we pay them some interest, we borrow more and more money as the years go by in order to spend money that we don't have. Now, what's been happening as of late and what is going to need to happen at an increasing pace is that the Federal Reserve is going to have to literally print money out of thin air to buy our own treasuries because we cannot sell enough debt to the rest of the world to be able to finance our overconsumption and our massive spending. Now, when the Federal Reserve prints money out of thin air and gives it to the government or buys treasuries or creates a massive increase in the money supply, that leads directly to what is called inflation or dollar devaluation. And I constantly run into people that fundamentally do not understand what it means when the government is devaluing the currency. So the government can pay for things really in only a couple ways. They can either collect taxes or other revenues, through things like tariffs or, different types of taxation that they do. And that's the money that the government is able to collect and spend. Now, the government has been spending vastly more money than that every single year for a very long time. Now, how much debt the government is actually incurring is very deceptive because the number that we see is the national debt. So this year, the national debt will probably rise 4 trillion, 6 trillion, 8 trillion. I mean, who knows? We haven't even got to the point where we're going to figure it out yet. But the reality is that the actual burden on the country is growing much, much faster than the national debt because of something called unfunded liabilities. So each year that goes by, the government takes on more unfunded liabilities for things like Social Security, Medicare, pension programs, things like that actually far exceed our typical deficit that we're running each year. So that means trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars every single year are getting added on to the backs of the entire country because there's no money to pay this stuff. The government doesn't collect enough money to pay it, so the only option they have is to print money and to issue more debt to essentially continue to pay the old debt, the interest, and have enough new money to spend so they can overspend and overconsume. So let's talk a little bit about this more in detail. So really what happens is by definition, when the Fed prints money out of thin air, they're essentially creating inflation in the economy. And again, I talk to people almost every day that fundamentally do not understand what inflation is and how it affects them in a negative way. So essentially, inflation is a tax on the entire country, on the purchasing power of the entire country, on the work product, the savings, any income, fixed income that you are set to receive in the future essentially is being taxed away through inflation or devaluation in the dollars that you currently own or that you currently have worked hard to obtain. So let me share with you a simple example of what I'm talking about. Let's say a worker started at Starbucks 20 years ago as a barista, and their hourly pay 20 years ago was $5 an hour, and a latte cost $1. Now, if you fast forward 20 years, let's say the same worker, same job, now he or she earns $12 an hour, but a latte now costs $5. Okay, so the cost of the latte over a 20-year period went from being 1/5 of the worker's pay to being 5/12 of the worker's pay. Now, assuming that job deserves the same earning power as it did, 20 years ago, which makes sense, it's the same job, same career, same industry, the worker became far, far, far worse off as a result of inflation because his earning power clearly did not keep up with the cost of living or the inflation in the economy. This is what has happened in America for a very long time as a result of reckless monetary policy by the Federal Reserve and reckless fiscal policy by the federal government. So as time goes on, the dollars that people are earning are no longer able to buy them the same amount or of goods and services in the economy, effectively making them poorer and poorer and poorer over time. This is what's happening in America. This is why people don't have any savings and cannot survive a 1 month or a 2 month or a 3 month downturn in the economy because they don't have enough money to purchase the basic necessities that they need, like housing, food, health insurance, and whatever other items the typical family is going to need. This is how the government is making us all poorer through inflation and through printing money that doesn't exist to, in the short run, spend money or make people believe that they're actually giving us something for nothing, which is certainly not the case. Now, let's dive a little deeper. Let's get into the nitty-gritty here of what the real costs to some of this stuff that the Federal Reserve and that the government is doing now really is to the average person and how that ultimately plays out in the economy. So as we see the government, issue new debt or print money to give away, the reality is, and all this data and all this news is starting to come out now, that the average worker is ultimately going to get very little of this money. Most of the money is going into corporate America, financial companies, hedge funds, private equity companies. They're getting billions and billions and billions of dollars. Yes, in the short run, potentially some jobs will be saved for a few months, but as soon as that money runs out or that gets paid, those companies ultimately are going to have to downsize as a result of the economic hardship that we're facing. They're going to have to make sure that they're running efficiently and that they don't have employees that are not productive, that aren't able to work because of the economy, so on and so forth. So in the short run, you see this little bump, you get your $1,200 check, you think somehow that you're being helped by the government, but here's the reality. If you take $6 trillion, roughly speaking, what this first bill is going to generate in terms of money and money printing and all this kind of stuff in the economy, and you say that in America you have roughly 360 million people, but in reality, you only want to look at the people who are actually in the workforce and are actually productive in some form or another, meaning that they're paying some taxes, a reasonable amount of taxes, to help eventually, in theory, pay off some of this massive amounts of debt that is getting lumped onto our backs each year. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that in reality you have 100 to 150 million Americans, because you're discounting for people that are no longer in the workforce, for children, people that are on government assistance, people that don't make enough money to pay any meaningful amount of taxes, etc. So if you end up with 150 million Americans and you divide that into the $6 trillion that's going to get created out of thin air, ultimately you end up with about, let's say $45,000, $50,000 per person, per, a productive American citizen who's paying taxes in this country. Now, if on top of that you take the national debt, which is 24 trillion or whatever it is today, and you divide it the same way, you end up with a grand total of probably roughly about $250,000 on the back of the average productive American in this country. If you're a married couple, you're at $500,000, okay? So that's how much debt is on your back if you just look at the debt only. Now, obviously, the unfunded liabilities are a whole nother issue that nobody ever wants to talk about and that the government never mentions or anything like that, that makes that number, vastly greater. So here's the reality. Unless you are getting, from this stimulus, this $6 trillion, your $50,000 worth of that money, then you are actually going to end up far worse off, whether it is going to be through monetary devaluation, dollar devaluation, inflation, or future and current taxation that is going to need to be ramped up in order to pay off this incredible, unimaginable amount of debt that we're taking on in the short run to make people believe that the government somehow has the ability to help people by printing all this money. So what's happening now is the worst thing that can possibly happen, and that is that the Federal Reserve and the government is getting caught in a vicious cycle, kind of like a negative feedback loop, because as we continue to take on more debt, then we need to print more money, and the rest of the world is not willing to loan us more money. So we end up having the Federal Reserve have to monetize the debt, meaning the government creates treasuries and the Federal Reserve just prints money out of thin air and buys up those treasuries. So essentially, that whole process is fundamentally just semantics, and the reality is we're just printing money to spend money that we don't have, which is what happens in countries that end up in hyperinflation like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, the Weimar Republic in Germany. This is how hyperinflation starts to take off and things get completely out of control, and the whole country ends up absolutely devastated in a long-term depression with hyperinflation, complete stagnation, absolute poverty, and this is all as a result of what the Federal Reserve is doing now, all in the name of trying to convince people that they're actually helping us and trying to help small businesses and save jobs and all this baloney which the mainstream media pushes on us as facts, and the Federal Reserve and the government continues using as the narrative to convince you that somehow what they're doing for you is actually good and beneficial. So here's an example of how this whole entire bailout, all of this stuff is just totally gamed and rigged. Obviously this PPP program, the idle loans, this stuff came out, and when it originally came out, it was promised that small businesses, including sole proprietors, independent contractors, self-employed people, were going to be able to have access to this money. Now, what happened with the PPP loans, and I predicted this before any of this stuff became available, is that the large banks made it so only businesses with a prior business relationship, and in most cases a prior business loan or credit relationship, actually had access to this loan application. And so what happened was they turned around after the fact and said that self-employed people, independent contractors, had to wait until April 10th before they were allowed to apply. And in reality, most independent contractors, self-employed individuals do not have business accounts or business loan relationships at the major banks. And so what happened is by the 10th, there were already a massive amount of applications in, and the majority of the money had already been given away to much larger businesses. And of course, now information is coming out that in fact, public companies, hedge funds, all kinds of companies that really were not in the spirit of what this money was supposed to go to are the ones who, it turns out, really got all the money and got it almost immediately. And think about it from a bank's perspective. If you are a company that has a relationship and or owes the bank money, has loans out, clearly their incentive is to give that money to their clients who actually owe them money, to increase the likelihood that those clients do not default on the loans that they have, right? So the 10th rolls around, the application is not correct and doesn't apply to an independent contractor or self-employed person. All the banks, who wouldn't even accept applications from, non-business clients, etc., either stopped accepting applications or had way too many applications in the pipeline, and they wouldn't allow you to go and create a business account, even if you were in business as of the date required by the legislation, essentially making it so none of those self-employed people, none of those independent contractors actually had any access to any of this money. And then, of course, around the 15th or whatever it was, the money had already run out, and a lot of the genuinely small businesses, small sole proprietors who don't have employees, independent contractors, etc., actually never had any chance of getting any of this money or anything like that. I called in the very beginning that that's what they would do, and then they would turn around and do another gigantic bill and just pull the same thing, a second time. And of course, here we have the news. Pelosi says deal close after holding up clean refunding, meaning that she did not want to agree to a pork-free clean version of the bill. Of course, everybody wants to get their pork in. Everybody wants to put all kinds of terrible things for the United States into these bills, increasing government power, making people worse off, making sure the Trump administration has access to $500 billion with no oversight, no control on where the money gets spent. That the Fed can do anything and everything they want, that they don't have to have any transparency any longer in their meetings or the decision-making processes that they have. So essentially, they can just give the money away to whoever they really want to. And that's exactly what has happened. And now you look and we're seeing states and cities come to Congress on top of corporations begging for a bailout. Here we have insolvent Illinois begs Congress for a pension bailout. Now, Illinois was insolvent, was, in massive debt because of terrible decision making, massive pensions that were way, way, way above where they should have been for a very long time. This was their own fault, their own creation, and now they want to run to the government and ask for a bailout, which, as we discussed in the beginning of this video, there is no such thing as a bailout. If the government gives them money that the government doesn't have by printing even more money, it just increases the speed that we're headed towards absolute devastation in this country and increases the vicious cycle of having to borrow more and more debt to maintain the debt and the interest that we already have. And it also just makes us more and more insolvent in terms of visibility to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world realizes we're a runaway train in terms of debt and inflation. We're never going to pay any of our debt off. All the treasuries that the rest of the world is holding, at these ridiculously low interest rates, wherever these people bought these treasuries at over the years, they know they're going to lose vastly more money than they're ever going to get from inflation, because we're inflating away the currency, devaluing the currency. So, of course, what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to get rid of those as fast as they can. And the rest of the world is going to want to stop buying U.S. debt. And once that happens, interest rates are going to be forced higher, and the Federal Reserve is no longer going to be able to control it. Now, what they'll try to do in the short run is do what they've already been doing, which is go around the rest of the world, in the United States, wherever, and buy up any treasuries they possibly can to try to artificially keep the interest rate low. But eventually, if the rest of the world doesn't want our debt anymore, if Americans aren't stupid enough to buy U.S. treasuries at 0.5% or 0.8% or whatever it is at the time, then it's really game over, because that means that the Federal Reserve is just monetizing 100% of the U.S. debt. We're going to have hyperinflation. ultimately absolute economic devastation. We're going to have, long-term depression, and really, probably the collapse of fiat currency, the collapse of the banking system. Everybody's going to end up broke in the breadline, except for the 1% that, got all the money, that were able to get all that wealth that was transferred before everything went bust, and, buy properties all over the world, invest in international assets, foreign currencies, gold, so on and so forth. And finally, one last article here just talks about record government and corporate debt risks tipping point after pandemic passes. I mean, this is obvious, right? I mean, you can't, this country for a very long time has been borrowing vastly more money than the productivity that we're getting for that money. So what that means is that, if the government spends, $2 or $3 to create $1 in productivity in the economy, we are destroying the value of $2 to $3, for somebody, the bag holder, at the end of the day, whenever that comes due or that reality becomes apparent. So in this country, we've been running, about a 2% growth rate in the GDP, and debt across the board has been growing much faster than that number. So government last year, let's say, we had $1 trillion deficit. That's about 4% of GDP, and GDP grew at 2%, which means that it cost us $2 in government spending to create $1 in GDP growth, and that does not even take into account the public debt, corporate debt, and all other different types of forms of debt, and that also doesn't take into account the growth in unfunded liabilities. So clearly, we do not want to spend $10 to create $1 in growth in the economy. I mean, at that rate, at that pace, the country is going to be bankrupt before you know it. We need to borrow money only if it creates more value than the money that we had to borrow in order to create that value. So, for instance, if a company can borrow $100 and make $110 or $150, assuming that all of their other costs are paid out of that, then that is value creation. That is healthy borrowing. But if a company has to borrow $200 and at the end of the day they only make $100 and they also take on another $100 in unfunded liabilities in that process, then essentially they've destroyed $200 in value, and that can go on only as long as people are stupid enough to keep loaning that company money or until they can no longer pay those unfunded liabilities. America is in the exact same position, and the exact same thing is going to happen most likely much sooner than later. I would think that it would be pretty miraculous if the Fed is able to blow a mega bubble this time around and kick the can down the road one more time. I think that it's very likely that we're going to see some sort of major collapse this cycle, because this stuff is absolutely out of control. What the government needs to do is stop spending money immediately, let markets adjust, let debt go bad, let companies go bankrupt and restructure, so that way they can quickly come back and hire people without a bunch of debt on their balance sheet. We need a healthy recovery and adjustment in the U.S. economy, but these guys are never going to let that happen. They want massive inflation, they want to devalue the currency, they want everybody poor, and they want to make the rich richer and richer.